I'm gonna go ahead and get started then. Hold on, I should really put this here so I can check the time at some point. So I'm gonna do something completely insane and impossible, and I want to try and give you an overview of ancient Egyptian history. It's insane and impossible because even if I just focus strictly on what we consider to be the core of ancient Egyptian history. And we just do it to the point where the Romans conquer Egypt in 31 BC. Egypt is about 3,000, or I'm not even doing it right. So let's just do it this way. Egypt invented government probably somewhere around 6,500 years ago. It then unified and became a single state ruling the entire country about 3,100 BC, so 5,100 years ago. And then Egypt ruled itself, but got conquered multiple times along the way until 31 BC. So I'm going to try and cover a period of time really about 4,000 years in length, which is not doable, but I like the challenge, so let's see what happens. So first of all, before I do anything, I want to sort of do the geography. If you think of Egypt, you probably think of a desert country, and that is a very reasonable place to go. About 10% of the state called the Arab Republic of Egypt is arable land. And of course, by arable, I mean you could grow something on it. You grow food on it. So 90% desert. But it's not strictly what you probably think of when you think of desert, which is just rolling sand dunes. There is a chunk of Egypt in the western desert that does have the rolling sand dunes. Most of it is just arid, rocky landscape with mountains. If you've been to Arizona, right, it's filled with cactuses. Get the cactuses out of your image and just do the Rocky Mountains. Not Rocky Mountains, but the mountains that are rocky. There we go. Because we were so creative when we named those mountains. So Egypt also gets very little precipitation, which is why it's a desert. And as a result, there's this narrow band of green that goes through the middle, and then at the very end, it opens up into the Nile Delta. That exact combination is precisely why Egypt becomes what it becomes. So I shouldn't say precisely. It's a large chunk of it. And the reason is part of it is cultural. Part of it is the culture that develops in Egypt that pushes it to go in the direction that it goes. But part of it is geographical. The fact that it's surrounded by desert makes it a hard place to invade, not impossible. It gets invaded and it gets conquered multiple times. But it discourages invasion because you're going to have to navigate the desert. To get there. Or you come by sea, but that's also complicated. So it makes it so that it's naturally defensive. Like Egypt is a natural fortress in every direction, effectively. But the Nile itself is this shockingly fertile place. Per acre, for the vast majority of the time we've been doing agriculture, so of the last 12,000 years, for the first 11,700, 11,800 years, per acre, the Nile Valley was the most fertile place on the planet. And so that also gave the Egyptians this really incredible advantage. So they're separated from the rest of the world by the desert, or the Mediterranean Sea, or the Red Sea. And then at the same time, they've got this incredible fertile strip that goes through the middle of that desert. The desert itself is filled with resources. Egypt had a lot of gold. There's basically fertilizer in the desert. So farmers go out into the desert and they'll bring whatever mineral, like you're low on phosphates, you go out in the desert and you dig up the phosphates and you bring them. So it gives you this enormous advantage agriculturally to have that desert there. And then as if that isn't enough, it's where Africa and Asia connect. And it turns out that strip of land between Africa and Asia is narrow enough, you can put a canal through it. And so the Suez Canal that exists today is something like the 10th iteration of that canal. The ancient world actually built it multiple times. And so for the longest time, much of the world's trade, for most of probably the last 4,500 years, the bulk of the world's trade has gone through the Suez Canal, or whatever version there was at the time. And as a result, it meant that Egypt was also at the center of trade. So all of this kind of creates this geographical advantage that Egyptians have. The agriculture, Egypt is the second place on earth to do agriculture. The agriculture that Egypt does is kind of lazy man's agriculture in the beginning. First of all, people don't do agriculture because it's this great innovation. They do it because they have to. If you do gathering and hunting, your life is better. You have a better diet. Your life expectancy is better because you have medicine, for one thing. You work less hard. You spend less time defending a chunk of territory. Somebody comes, you just simply move. You don't have to fight for anything. There's no warfare. Populations are dispersed, so if a plague breaks out, it'll wipe out a section of the population, but it's not going to spread because there isn't a lot of interaction between different communities. And so as a result, life is just simply better under gathering and hunting. Think about it. We've been on the planet for probably 450,000 years. A few years ago, I would have told you 200,000 years, but we now have found a 400,000-year-old human skull in Morocco. So probably more like 450,000 years at least. And we didn't start doing agriculture until 12,000 years ago. It was such a great innovation. Surely we could have figured out plant seed in ground. Ooh, crop grows. Harvest. Genius, let's keep doing this. Instead, what probably happened was somebody was like gathering seeds, a seed fell, they went, oh, came back later, crop grew, went, oh, I'm not doing that ever again, because of the amount of labor that goes into it, because of the amount of suffering that goes into it. When we did agriculture, we began doing grains, wheat, rice, of course, and then in the New World, corn. Well, grains store well. You can put them in a storage facility, but then they dry up. And you can't not let them dry up, because if you don't, they'll rot, right? So you end up having to grind them, and you grind them between two stones, and then that creates sandpaper effect. So when you're eating bread, you're not going to have teeth. And so, by 23, you don't have teeth. Life sucked under agriculture. People didn't do it happily. They did it kicking and screaming. And so that was true in Egypt. What you do is you'd go out, you'd throw the seeds in the field, and then you'd harvest what you needed, and you'd let the rest rot on the vine, and you wouldn't bother with it. That eventually led to the creation of granaries. And the reason it led to the creation of granaries was because Egypt's weather system was completely reliant on how much precipitation there was in Central Africa. If there was a lot of precipitation around equatorial Africa, then Egypt's annual flood would happen on target, and everybody would be happy, and there would be lots of food. If there was too much rain, it would flood too much, and the seeds would rot in the ground. If there wasn't enough rain, it wouldn't flood enough, and you wouldn't get your crop all the way through. And so you were reliant on the weather in a place that you couldn't even see because it was too far away. And so what Egyptians had to do was build granaries to compensate for that. The act of building the granary required people to not just make the decision to do it. They had to work together as a community, because there's no way an individual small family could make its own granary. You were going to have to do this on a large scale. And then you had to replicate the granary, right? You can't just build the granary, because the act of building it, it immediately begins to decay. You're using mud brick, you're using thatching for your roof. The thatching's already rotting. If there is rain, because it did occasionally rain, the mud brick is literally melting. You're bringing in pots, you're putting in grain. The pots break over time. Rats break into the granary and break open the pots. You have to constantly replicate the granary because you have to maintain it. That act of transgenerational self-replication is the creation of an institution. But it's a politically motivated institution, because what it's trying to do is it's trying to manipulate economic systems to create a specific outcome. In other words, that is literally the birth of politics and government. It is the intentional manipulation of the economic system to create an outcome, in this case, an insurance policy. So there's a drought next year, no big deal, we stored a bunch of grain. We'll ride it out. Oh, the drought lasted 3 years? Cool, we stored 3 years worth of grain. By the way, the technology that they had, the grain stored for about 5 years. So that meant they literally had to replace the grain every 5 years. But if you do it every 5 years, it means you have to produce 5 years worth of harvests During that 5-year period, that makes no sense. What you're better off doing is every year producing 2 years worth of harvest. You eat one, you store one. And then that way you just keep the system constantly restored, and then you throw out if you want to store 5 years, then you throw out that year worth of grain that's old and rotten, or eat it or whatever. Give it to your animals. In any case, that sometime around 6,500 years ago happened in various communities up and down the Nile. And it led to a more organized form of warfare. What happened was certain communities realized, oh, we've made a mistake, we didn't store enough grain, this is a bad famine, let's attack our neighbors, take some of their grain, right? Or somebody went, our neighbors are looking really weak, let's do an opportunity attack and go punk them. On top of that type of opportunistic warfare, something else happened. So this is going to mess with some of you. It turns out that one of the world's first ecological disasters, let me rephrase it, one of the world's first human-made ecological disasters is the Sahara, that big desert that you call the Sahara. The Sahara used to be prairie. It used to be grassland. Human beings overgrazed it with domesticated animals and created a desert that's larger than the United States of America. Isn't that cool? That's like one of the first things we do. We just destroy this massive grassland and turn it into a desert that's still growing today. The Sahara grows every year. It's expanding. And it's been basically expanding now for like 11,000 years. Well, at some point, around 6,500 years ago, the Sahara got to a point where too much of the ecosystem had collapsed all at once. It was sort of a sudden thing. That's one of the cool things about nature. Like it keeps building, and then it collapses all at once. And you're like, oh, wow, why couldn't you have spread this out? It'd be boring. That's why. This is better this way. And what ended up happening was a bunch of the people living in the Sahara who were herders then pour into the Nile Valley. And they're desperate because their ecosystem just collapsed. They need food, and they want to feed their animals. And there ends up being a violent conflict between the population already living in the Nile Valley and then these Saharans coming in an act of desperation to get out of the desert that they created by overgrazing. And in the conflict that results, there's a new culture that's made, and that's the Egyptian culture. In other words, the Egyptian culture is exactly the hybrid culture of the population who were originally living in the Nile and then these Saharans who come pouring in out of desperation. And then what slowly starts to happen is some of those little states get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they start to get serious advantage regionally. And by the year 5100, an Egyptian king in southern Egypt, in Upper Egypt, right, because the Nile flows north, so Upper Egypt is in the south. I know this messes with you because you're north-centric, but there is nothing up about north and nothing down about south, so stop. So in Upper Egypt, a guy named Armour actually manages to conquer Lower Egypt, and for the first time in human history, basically, a country is unified. And he takes the state apparatus that had been slowly evolving and he superimposes it on all of Egypt. He moves his capital to Memphis and makes that the capital. Memphis is in Lower Egypt. He does that so that he can be closer to the people he just conquered, right? Because he wants to keep his eye on them. He knows that Upper Egyptians will be loyal. He's not sure about Lower Egyptians. So he moves the capital to the north, in the conquered region, and begins running this brand new state. In the build-up to that, the state kept making things to make things better, to make life better. So one of the things that happened was probably around 5,400 or so years ago, right around the same time Sumer is inventing written language, Egypt started inventing written language as well. Sumer was a little bit more advanced. And the reason they did it was they had this problem. Okay, so we've got this much grain, and we have this many cows, and we have, that many goats. That's great, but how do we keep track of it all? And what had happened was some of these kings had actually commissioned some of their scholars to go and create a mechanism for keeping track of the resources that were available. And so what they had to do is they had to come up with a symbol that they would use over and over and over again for cow, a symbol that they would use over and over again for dried fig, a symbol for dates, a symbol for wheat. And then they needed a number system to go with it so you would know how much, right? And then you had to have a system of weights and measures because the grain, you're not going to count it by grain. That would take forever. You need some kind of mechanism like this many bushels. And so what they had to do, because of necessity, political necessity, is invent writing and math. And they do it all at the same time. And it takes about 300 years to turn into what we know today as hieroglyphics. By the way, if you ever go to the Cairo Museum, when you walk in the front door, there's a hallway to your right, a hallway to your left, and a hallway straight ahead. The hallway straight ahead, there's a pretty big statue. It's of Amenhotep III and his wife T. Head towards it. What's really remarkable about the statue, I'm pointing it out to you so that if you go, you'll remember this moment, is they're sitting next to each other. They're on thrones. It's really massive statue, actually. For Egyptian scale, it's small, but for us, it's massive. You're walking towards these two enthroned people. Look at the tops of their heads. Amenhotep III's head is slightly lower than Queen T's head. Now, one of the reasons is Queen T is wearing, the ancient Egyptians used to put a tub of fat in a hat on top of their head. So if you've ever seen ancient Egyptian women, they have this thing sticking up off their head. What they would do is they would mix perfume essence in. And so as the heat from your head warmed up the fat, it would release perfume. It was their little perfume device. And her little perfume device is slightly higher than Amenhotep's head. The Egyptians didn't miss little details like that. If there's one adjective for the Egyptians, it's meticulous. They were obsessed with small details. That statue tells us all you need to know about their relationship. She was in charge, right? Just for contrast, Ramses II has a statue, massive statue, where he's standing, and he's got 1 foot forward, and he's like, and he's all buff. And, the statue, he's probably like a 50-year-old man with saggy muscles. But not in that statue, he's all like ripped and ready to go. And he's like this. And there's a queen, she's like this short. She comes up to his hip, and she has her arms around his leg. So you know who's in charge in that family, right? These are important little details. So you can tell kind of family dynamics by looking at these statues. In any case, when you're looking at T and Amenhotep III, I need you to drop your eyes down. There's a table right there. So you've just come into this hallway. On the table is a little, it's like a shield-shaped piece of stone inside glass sticking up. It is, in fact, a piece of stone that was carved to commemorate the moment Armour conquered Lower Egypt and created the first state that ever ruled over an entire unified country. And so it's this big, right? Like you're running around Egypt and you've seen the pyramids probably by this point, man-made mountains, right? Just gigantic mountain. And then here's this little itty-bitty, elegant, delicate piece of stone carving that goes, here we are. We just invented the world's first ever unified state. Armour creates what we call the first dynasty. So I'm going to do something that's going to piss off Egyptologists. So if any Egyptologist ever sees this, they'll probably write me really nasty commentary here. According to most Egyptologists, until recently anyway, there were 30 Egyptian dynasties. It's become popular now to say there were 31 Egyptian dynasties. There were 33 Egyptian dynasties. We don't count the last two, and I've been pondering this for years. Like this is kind of a strange thing, these last two. And the second to the last one was the Argoid. You would understand it better if I told you who it was. It was Alexander III, that you call Alexander the Great. Alexander the Mediocre is probably better. Oh, he was great. He was just a narcissist. He was such a narcissist, it's hard for me to like him. Anyway, I mean, don't get me wrong. A little bit of narcissism didn't hurt anybody, but he's so over the top. And then that doesn't really last very long because his son, Alexander IV, gets killed when he's like 14, I think, when he gets poisoned by the general in charge of keeping him safe, and his mom too. So that doesn't go well. So that's a really short dynasty. The dynasty immediately after that is the Ptolemaic dynasty. We call it the Ptolemaic dynasty, but we don't call it then Dynasty 33. And here's what I've heard, and I've thought it through, and I think I'm onto something here. It's because they weren't Egyptian, but that's actually true of multiple other dynasties. Like the 15th and 16th dynasties are both Hyksos dynasties. Like there are multiple non-Egyptian dynasties. The 31st dynasty, the one that we now only recently are calling the 31st dynasty, those were Persians. There was a Cushitic dynasty. There was an Assyrian dynasty. There was another Persian dynasty. So it's not that they're foreigners, that you're not counting the 33rd dynasty, the 33rd dynasty. It's because they're white. And so I actually think the way we've set up the whole dynastic thing is inherently racist. So I'm going to call the Ptolemaic dynasty the 33rd dynasty, and I'm going to call Alexander the Great's dynasty the 32nd dynasty, just so that we can try to overcome your Eurocentric biases. Just because Europeans ruled Egypt didn't mean the dynastic system ended. Also, especially because the Ptolemies called themselves pharaohs dressed like Egyptians, used Egyptian artwork, built Egyptian-style temples, and worshipped a Greco-Egyptian hybrid god, right? I mean, it's not that they were Greeks, they wiped out the Egyptian population and replaced it like we did here. Right, it's not that at all. They integrated in and looked up to they even misinterpreted Egyptian rules and tried to implement them and made a mess of things. So these dynasties are then themselves broken down into periods. So the first period we call the early period, which is the first dynasty and the second dynasty, which are Armour's dynasty and the one that immediately follows him. Oh, just for the record, to give you an idea of scale, the average Egyptian dynasty went 93 years. So when I'm talking about these first two dynasties, they varied. Some of them went quite long. Just sort of keep in mind that we're talking roughly a century per dynasty. It's not always the case. In fact, there was an Egyptian pharaoh who by himself went a century. Pepi II, I think it's Pepi II. He's the longest run monarch in human history. He went, I think, 101 years. And the really cool thing about it is he was such a bad ruler. He was the last pharaoh of the 6th dynasty. He not only causes his dynasty to collapse, he caused ancient Egypt to collapse. And it ends up in a 170 year, no, it was longer than that. About a 2-century long civil war because he was such a bad ruler. But they let him last. It went 100 years. Why wasn't there somebody there to kill him? It just makes those things like, geez, did you not come up with that concept yet? Like term limits, assassination, elections, something. Clearly, you saw there was something wrong with this guy. He has a pyramid though, so I guess he couldn't have been that bad. In any case, he was that bad. The next 4 dynasties, so 3 through 6, are what we call the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is probably what you imagine when you imagine Egypt. The 3rd dynasty is when they build the first pyramid. It's built in Saqqara. Saqqara is south of Egypt. I'm sorry, south of Egypt. I did an Egyptian thing. In Egypt, Egyptians call Cairo Egypt. They call it Misr, which means it actually doesn't mean Egypt at all. So let's talk about the name real quick, just so that we can get that out of the way, since I started this conversation. So the ancient Egyptians called Egypt Kemet, K-M-T. We actually don't know what the vowel sounds were, because like Arabic today, they didn't necessarily keep track of the vowel sounds. And so it could be Komot, Kumat, Kemit. We have no idea. Most people just say Kemet and get it over with. It literally means black. And the reason they named Egypt black was because the Nile Valley was this incredibly fertile soil, and it's really dark. They named the area around the desert Deshret. Deshret meant red. So they named Egypt basically black and red. So that was the ancient Egyptian name, Kemet. When the Greeks came, they heard Gopt. So they said, what do you call this country? Kemet. Gopt. Kemet. Gopt. And that's probably how that conversation went for several days. When the Romans came along, they went, I gopt. And of course, they need to put an us on the end of everything, and it became Aigoptus. And then Aigoptus over time became Egypt. And that's the origin of the word Egypt. Kemet. Egypt. Kemet. Like, how did we get here? You wish they had Q-tips back then. Just get in there, get some of that wax out. And then the Arabs conquered Egypt. This is way very recent to us, way closer to us than the stuff I'm talking about is. But it's worth pointing out because Egypt is today an Arabic state as opposed to an ancient Egyptian state. When the Arabs conquered Egypt, they created their capital was Masr al-Fustat, which literally means the citadel of tents. And that became basically the capital for the Arab-conquered Egypt. And then eventually the Fatimids replaced Masr al-Fustat with Masr al-Qahira, which means the citadel of the conqueror. Al-Qahira is Cairo. But over time, the Arabs just started calling all of Egypt Masr al-Qahira, and then over time, it just became Masr. So if you meet an Egyptian and they refer to Masr, they could mean one of two things: the capital that you call Cairo, or the country that you call Egypt. And so if I do that again, that's why I'm doing it. That's how it's wired in my brain. Okay, so the idea that if you go to Saqqara, it's south of Cairo. You're going to need to do an extra trip. Giza, the famous pyramids, are right there. I mean, they're just west of Cairo. You can see them from parts of the city. Saqqara is too far away to see from the city. You can actually see the pyramids of Saqqara if you get up on the Giza Plateau and look south. So if you ever go to the Giza Plateau, make sure you look south, and on the horizon you can see the Saqqara pyramids. There's also a set of pyramids in between that nobody goes to because they're really small and insignificant. But you can see those two from Giza. When you go to Saqqara, the pyramid that you're primarily going to go see is Djoser's Step Pyramid. The Step Pyramid was the world's first ever pyramid. What happened was Djoser had an advisor, a wazir, named Imhotep. And Imhotep is the world's first ever great inventor. He invented the world's first ever stone arches. He's the guy who invented the pyramids. He invented stoneware plates. He laid the foundation work for creating mosaic art. Like, this is that guy. He just went around inventing stuff. And what happened was, he said, when Egyptians buried, they buried in a mastaba, which was just basically a raised platform, and then they would put you underneath the raised platform. And he said, you're Pharaoh. What you need is a thing that's so giant, it's actually literally a series of raised platforms. It's a series of mastabas stacked on top of each other. And that's why it's shaped like a series of steps, is because that's what it was supposed to represent, was a series of mastabas stacked on top of each other. When you're there, when you go to Saqqara, make sure to go over to the buildings on the side. You can see the stone arches built into the side. So you can see, that's Imhotep's work. He was like, we can support more weight on a stone arch. That dynasty plus the next three, so 3, 4, 5, 6, they're the ones who go into this massive pyramid building spree. They will eventually build the pyramids on the Giza Plateau, the largest structure ever built. The tallest structure built until like 1887 when it was finally passed, is the Great Pyramid in Giza. It's massive. It was built about 4,600 years ago. And it wasn't built the way you think. So the Hollywood version of pyramid building is that the Egyptians were these really cruel bastards who went around enslaving people, and then, they'd whip the hell out of them, and they'd make them build pyramids. And then to punish them when they misbehaved, they'd take the straw away so that they would make bad clay bricks. By the way, that's a really weird thing to do. Like, if you're going to punish somebody, you think you'd give them more straw and make them make better clay bricks, not worse. But anyway, that's not true. None of that's true. Delete that whole thing. Delete even the clay brick punishment thing. That's all wrong. It's not true. What happened was the ancient Egyptians believed that building this type of a structure, whether it was a pyramid or a temple or a shrine, anything like that, was in and of itself a holy act that brought you closer to the gods, that connected you to the universe, that made you part of your community. So that when you participated voluntarily in doing something like building a pyramid, you did it because you were making the world a better place. You did it because you were defeating death. They believed that pyramids were machines that were capable of actually transcending death. So that even though you and your body would die, your spirit would then actually go to the afterlife. The really crazy thing is, in a way, they were right. Whether you believe that there's an afterlife or not doesn't matter, but because I'm now talking about this, right? Their act makes it so that we constantly have to remember them, or we maybe even want to remember them. And so in a way, they really are still with us. Certainly their monuments are still with us. No slave would have ever been anywhere close to a pyramid because they would have believed that having a slave touch a pyramid would have contaminated that pyramid. And then also, you need to get the slavery model out of your mind in the way that you probably think of it. The ancient Egyptians wouldn't have had the concept that they were going to enslave whole nations. They didn't do that. What they did was they were sort of opportunity slavery. There was a group of people, that were slowly taken as slaves, probably because they were poor or they were in a position of weakness. And then they were used as domestic servants. Don't have like a field full of cotton and there are slaves out there. We're talking about people who would cook and clean for you. And so it wasn't, we kind of need two words for slavery here. We need one for the really brutal, psychotically vicious, violent thing that the United States did, and the French and the Portuguese did. And then we need something for the ancient form of slavery that the Romans and the ancient Egyptians and the Greeks did, which was a completely different institution. So then the question is, how can you build something so massive on volunteer labor? Now, it's volunteer. You couldn't get paid for it because they didn't have coins. So there was no money transaction possible. What happened was, Egypt was so good at generating huge surpluses of food that they could literally just say, hey, look at all this food we have. You farmers, why don't you stop farming, come help us build this pyramid. We'll feed you the whole time you're doing it. It makes you closer to God. You're making your community better. And we're also going to defeat death in the process. And people volunteered because people believed. And they would work these horrible, grueling hours moving blocks of stone that we can't comprehend today because we don't have that sense of community. We don't have that sense of connectivity. It's a question mark if you see somebody in trouble whether you'll stop to help them. You know what I mean? There's no way we're going to go build something together as a community because we're trying to reach some sort of higher meaning. We're not even sure we could stop to help somebody. In ancient Egypt, the single greatest sin that you could commit, it wasn't premarital sex, it wasn't having sex with the wrong gender, none of that stuff. It wasn't getting a tattoo somewhere on your body. None of that was considered a sin, actually. The sin was if you let somebody starve to death or go thirsty. There was no sin worse. It was such a bad sin, your chances of getting in the afterlife was really zero. You needed to know you were a host. Whereas we're like, yeah, look at the poor starve. Bye. It's our war on poverty. Let the poor starve. They're no longer poor. It's genius. It's genius because they're dead. Anyway, so the ancient Egyptians pull off something that is also kind of impossible. So that Great Pyramid, the model you have in your mind, because of probably a Hollywood movie at some point, is there's Jewish slaves. Judaism didn't exist. There were no Jewish slaves involved when the pyramids were being built. It's just it's anachronistic. Could not have happened because there was no Jewish population yet. There were pre-Jewish proto-Semites or Semites who hadn't yet become what we think of as Jews when the pyramids were being built. So that, get rid of that. And then you have this image probably of piles of sand, and then they're laying blocks, right? And they're going up these sand ramps. The big pyramid, Khufu, would require so much sand, you would have had to fill the Nile Valley. Like the real monument would have been moving all that sand around and filling this valley and making a giant dam of sand that would have eventually burst, by the way, probably, because it's just sand. And it would have been silly. So one of the things that we know is that's not how that pyramid was built. The other thing that's really remarkable is the size of the blocks. So the average block was a 2-ton limestone cube. But there are a bunch of these super massive granite blocks on the inside. Some of them are bigger than 20 tons. And they're not cube, and they're interlocking. They're actually held together. So not only did they cut these stones and then move them here, they had to elevate them in the air and then release them so that they would slide into place and then lock together. And the reason they made interlocking interior granite blocks was because of earthquakes. They made giant, human-made, earthquake-proof mountains, which is a crazy amount of technical skill. In the Bronze Age, bronze is not a strong enough material to cut granite. And so we're not entirely sure how they cut granite. We know exactly how they cut the limestone. They would just take a stick. They'd run water over the limestone, and they'd run the stick back and forth, and that's enough. You can cut limestone. We got that one. You can do that with granite all day. You're not going to cut it. But it's not just cut granite. It's polished granite. It's not just polished cut granite. They've got the right angles on everything. So where they wanted a 90-degree angle, it really is a 90-degree angle. And then, of course, the crazy thing about the pyramids in Giza is they're perfect compasses. They're actually slightly off, but we think that's just the Earth's natural wobble. We use the pyramids to confirm our hypotheses about the Earth's wobble, because the Earth has a couple of wobbles. The pyramids are so perfect from 4,600 years ago. So those are the major monuments from the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th dynasties. They collapse. The Pepi II is an incompetent ruler. Egypt goes into a period that we call the First Intermediate Period. It's a multi-decade-long civil war, basically. That's the way to think of it, with 4 dynasties. So Egypt isn't unified during this time period. It's in chaos. By the way, one of the things that's interesting is the quality of the artwork plunges. And they're not the statues don't look very good during this time period. It's, I think, one of the reasons why Egyptologists realized there was something wrong. They're like, how come this older statue is so much nicer than this newer statue? And then we just sort of realized, oh, there's political disruption. And apparently when there's political disruption, it can affect your artwork. Who would have known? In any case, those 4 dynasties are eventually replaced by what we now call the Middle Kingdom. So the Middle Kingdom kicks in the 11th dynasty, and it goes 3 dynasties, 11, 12, 13. The Middle Kingdom is they reestablished the Egyptian state so that it's a single state again. So they've conquered all of Egypt. They've brought it together. They actually think about resurrecting pyramid building, even though that's a lot of resources. And they do a few pyramids. But they're like, oh, I don't know. This is really a lot of resources. They go through this revitalization period. They rejuvenate Egypt. There are innovations taking place, and then that also comes crashing down. Egypt gets invaded. The invasion ultimately results in the conquest by the Hyksos. The Hyksos, I believe, are the 15th and 16th dynasties. I'm sure I'll get commentary on the YouTube page about how I screwed that up really badly. But one of the things that happens in this period when the Middle Kingdom collapses is there's another intermediate period that we call the Second Intermediate Period. And it too should be thought of like a prolonged, nasty civil war. Egypt breaks up. On the other side, when Egypt sort of comes out of this Second Intermediate Period, one of the things that's happened is they got invaded by people who had horses, the Hyksos. And they bring the horse to Egypt. And so now the Egyptian military, when it comes out of this, it's the 18th dynasty that pulls Egypt out. When they come out of this, they now have horses, they now have cavalry units. So this is a huge innovation for Egypt. But that's also something to think about. That means they didn't have horses when they were doing the pyramids. So all of the labor was pretty much human and oxen labor, pulling those blocks around. Also boats. They moved a lot of stuff along by water. By the time we get the 18th dynasty, which we call the New Kingdom, it too just goes 3 dynasties. So early dynasties are 2. Then the Old Kingdom is 4. The First Intermediate Period is 4. The Middle Kingdom is 3. And then the Second Intermediate Period is 4, which gets us to the New Kingdom and the 18th dynasty. The 18th dynasty is founded by a guy named Ahmose. We call him Ahmose the First because there's a really much further, much later, there's an Ahmose the Second. But it's like centuries later, so it's really weird. But that's Egypt, right? The scale is massive. The time periods are massive. So Ahmose conquers Egypt, establishes its capital at Luxor right around 1550-ish, a little bit before that, BC, so about 3,550 or so years ago. There is again there's a debate, do we start building pyramids again? We think that Thutmose III, who several pharaohs later, 1, 2, 3, 4, I think he's 5 pharaohs later, it might be 6, right in there. He builds we think his mortuary temple actually did include a small pyramid on the top. That's one of the hypotheses for how that thing was shaped. And I think Ahmose the First did a pyramid as well. He did a real pyramid as opposed to a small pyramid on top of a temple. And that's it. The Egyptians, well, until the Kushitic period, until the Kush people rule Egypt again, then they'll start building pyramids again. But that's essentially it for Egyptian pyramid building. I believe the final count on Egyptian pyramids is like 108. I think it's something like 218 pyramids in the Sudan. So Egypt eventually gets conquered by Nubians, that's the Kush period. And they rejuvenate, they revive pyramid building. But it's much later, and the pyramids they build are really small. And they tended to go for really skinny, tall, small pyramids. So when I say there's like 218 pyramids in the Sudan, you could take all of them and you could fit them in one of Egypt's sort of medium-sized pyramids without any difficulty. So the grand scale pyramid building that Egypt does is done at this point. Although I think it was 2008 we found 3 new pyramids. Satellite photography had revealed 3 strangely shaped giant sand dunes. And Egyptologists went out with a shovel and peeled away at the sand, and sure enough, there was a pyramid buried underneath. So who knows what we'll find in the future. I think it's really hard to comprehend that we're still finding pyramids. The 18th dynasty is, I think, so this is my bias, the most fascinating dynasty in Egyptian history. I also am a big fan of the Ptolemaic dynasty. I find the two of them really riveting, really fascinating. The characters are really intense. So it's worth pointing out that in ancient Egyptian civilization, men and women were about as equal as any civilization has ever achieved. I think the only civilization that's come close to that level of equality is Iceland today. Just to give you an idea of what I mean by that, women were scholars, women were pharaohs, women had leadership roles throughout Egyptian society. Women were business leaders. Women owned their own sexuality. And what that meant was that before a girl got married, her body was hers to do with, and then after she got married, her body was still hers to do with. Her sexuality didn't get transferred along with her name to her husband. So in other words, if a woman went out of the marriage for sex, that was just tough doo-doo. I mean, maybe you should do a better job of pleasing her so she doesn't feel like she needs to. And it was the man's fault, not the woman's fault, whereas we don't have that in our society, where men establish ownership by a piece of metal in the form of a ring and then a name change event. And you go, well, that's voluntary in our society, then how come 95% of the women I know do it? If it's 95%, it's clearly not voluntary. You know what I mean? That is not the definition of voluntary. In any case, we have this shockingly egalitarian society, and I want that to be the backdrop because some wild stuff happens in the 18th dynasty that sort of reveals that. So remember in the beginning I told you about Amenhotep III and his wife T. Well, they're from this dynasty. This is their dynasty. Thutmose II, who is the third or fourth, he's the fourth pharaoh in this dynasty. Thutmose II ends up marrying a second wife, I think, and her name was Hatshepsut. And he dies young enough that his oldest child, the child who should become the next pharaoh, his name is also Thutmose, isn't old enough yet to become pharaoh of Egypt. So Hatshepsut becomes the regent for Thutmose, the Thutmose that will become Thutmose III. Hatshepsut decides that after Thutmose III has reached the age where he could rule, that she's not cool with that, and she continues to rule as pharaoh. Now, when I say that Egypt got really close to being an egalitarian society along gender lines, we obviously need to caveat this a little bit. They didn't succeed. I don't mean to say they actually created equality. It's just they got really close. And one of the ways that can be represented is through what Hatshepsut does. So the goddess Hathor, she has her portrayed with Hatshepsut's face. So if you ever see a picture of a statue, or go to Egypt and see a statue of Hathor. Hathor is the cow goddess, goddess of motherhood. She's frequently portrayed as a cow. She has horns that come up, and then the sun disk on top of her head. But she's also portrayed as a human with a human face. So she's kind of right, Egyptians kind of blurred the line with their deities between animal and human. And so that's Hatshepsut's face. That's what she looked like if you see a picture of that, but with cow ears. And having said that, when she portrayed herself, not the goddess Hathor, but herself, she actually put a man's body on. So the statues to Hatshepsut show a man. But her face is slightly stylized enough that you might be a little confused at the gender of the statue, because it's just feminine enough. It could be a woman's face on a man's body. It's really weird and really jarring. But I think she did that because of the style of pharaoh she was. Not necessarily just because probably there was the type of sexism we still deal with today, where we sort of expect our leadership to be male. And the reason I'm saying that it's the style is she decided that she was going to have an empire. Now, her husband, Thutmose II, had actually started making an empire as well. So it wasn't that she was inventing empire. She was simply expanding it. But Egypt began to conquer northern Sudan. They went into Cyrenaica. People sometimes incorrectly say Cyrenaica. It's Cyrenaica, which is today eastern Libya. And then she also began sending armies into Palestine and then into Syria. And so she's expanding in every direction and making Egypt the world's first ever empire, a state that conquered territory outside of its country in order to expand at the expense of the people being conquered. She also sends an expedition to Punt. Some of you have actually heard me talk about the expedition to Punt. And so she's also doing exploration in addition to conquest. She commissions scientific missions. She actually is the person who invents obelisks. She starts sending people to the Sudan to get granite in the shape of an obelisk and starts planting them everywhere in commemoration of her glory. It's a great compromise on pyramid, right? It's tall, it's hard as hell to make, it's super fragile, it's made of granite, but it's not really wide, and so it doesn't take as much labor to pull off. But standing it upright is a feat in and of itself. And they're pulling it off. They're building these obelisks, and then she's killed. And it's kind of mysterious, although I have a feeling I know who did it. It was LBJ. It was Thutmose III. And we're pretty sure that her stepson gets sick of her being pharaoh and just poisons her and takes over. Thutmose III gets to go down in history as being the most successful military leader in human history. There's one other person. He's probably in a tie with them. Well, he's in a tie because we don't have a firm number on how many battles Thutmose III led. We know he was in 17 military campaigns. He led the armies himself. And we know he never lost a single battle. If there's an average of 5 battles per military campaign, that's 85 battles, right? If it was 3, that's 51. We don't really know. We just know he never lost a single battle. By the way, one of the battles Thutmose III fought was the Battle of Armageddon. A bunch of you are waiting for something that happened 3,500 years ago. Spoiler alert, he never lost a battle. Egypt won. So just a heads up, Battle of Armageddon settled 3,500 years ago by Thutmose III. He did it by an end-around movement. Anyway, it's okay. There was a canyon. The Hittites were at one end of the canyon thinking there's no way to go around the backside, and they were ready to go, and so the Egyptians went around the backside and caught the Hittites from the rear, and it was a really bad day for them. And that was the kind of leader that Thutmose III was, right? He was always thinking outside of the box. He'll take Egypt to its apex in terms of power. He'll conquer Cyprus. He sent an expedition to Crete. He ends up in what is today Turkey. So Egypt ends up this big, massive empire that stretches across the eastern Mediterranean. He sets up new trade routes. He builds new buildings. It's an extraordinary time period for Egypt. And then the next pharaoh is Thutmose IV. I'm pretty sure there's Amenhotep II in here somewhere. I think he's after Thutmose IV. Thutmose IV goes to what is today the Giza Plateau, the Cairo area, as a tourist, right? Because when he's going to the Giza Plateau, it's 1,100 years old. The pyramid of Khufu is 1,100 years old. He's going there to go look at ancient ruins. And he goes to the Sphinx, and he lays down next to the Sphinx and takes a nap. And during his nap, he has a dream. And the dream is that the Sphinx says, "Dear Pharaoh Thutmose IV, look at me. I'm in disrepair. I'm 1,100 years old, and I'm buried halfway up in sand." And Thutmose IV wakes up, and he's like, "That's it, I'm going to fix the Sphinx." And they dig the Sphinx out, because it had been buried in 11 centuries of sand buildup, and they do repairs on the Sphinx, because they thought that it was just such a cool ancient monument. And then there's Amenhotep III, the one in the front, the one in the museum with his Queen T. It is pretty clear T really was the ruler. Having said that, Amenhotep III, his son, glory to Amenhotep III, he built the single largest ever religious structure as a single building. The single largest ever religious compound is also in Egypt, but it's that thing. It'll haunt me for all eternity. It's on the other side of the Nile near Luxor. It's just north of Luxor. It's called Karnak. On the west side of the Nile is Amenhotep III's temple. It's gone. You can go there. There's stuff to see, but it was destroyed by a catastrophic earthquake. And then a lot of the stones were plundered by locals in the area who were building their homes with it. One of the things that Egyptology has actually had to do is go to people's homes and knock on their doors and then ask for permission to enter, and then look for, do you mind if we take that? And so there's a lot of active recovery constantly going on, especially in the Luxor area. Like there's a whole avenue of sphinxes that's sort of just been buried by the city over time. And there's been an active attempt to sort of dig them back up and get that avenue of sphinxes set back up. In any case, Amenhotep III builds this massive religious structure. It caves in. He dies. He gets replaced by Amenhotep IV. Amenhotep IV is going to do a revolution, but not just a political revolution. He's going to do a religious one too. He declares that the old gods, Amun-Ra, Anubis, all these gods that you think of when you think of ancient Egypt, Isis, Nephthys, Setha, right? Horus, all these gods, he declares them done. They're finished. That age is over. Those gods don't function anymore. He now declares that there is one God, and in the process creates the world's first ever monotheistic religion. Because the Jews are just getting their feet wet and taking off, but they're bitheists. They have Ashereth and Yahweh. They have a male god and a female goddess. Judaism was born with two gods. They wrote Ashereth out, though. Don't worry. They erased her. And then they switched over to a monotheistic, patriarchal, male god system. But so they're technically not monotheists. So he beats them to it. He declares that there is one God. His name is Aton. And the god Aton is the god of love. And, by the way, the sun. And he builds brand new temples. And they're easier to build than the old ones because they have no roofs on them. Because he doesn't want there to be a ceiling in between you and the God of love. And they prayed like this. If you go into a Coptic church today and you watch Egyptians, right, because about somewhere between 10 to 20% of Egypt's population is Christian. They're called Copts. It's 20%. But Egypt doesn't dare do a census because you would find out how many Christians are there, and that's politically bad. So the Egyptian government says it's 10%, but in reality it's about 20. If you go into the church, the Coptic church, you will see people praying like this, which is how you pray to the god Aton. It's like this little piece that got left over. Anyway, he does this heretical thing. He says because Aton, the god of love, is our god, the god of love isn't going to do warfare, and he simply pulls the Egyptian armies back, and the empire just disintegrates. And he lets all the conquered lands go back to ruling themselves. And he brings everybody home and he goes, we're just going to do love and happiness and joy. Your job is just to make families and worship Aton and produce food. And we're just going to have a good time together. The crazy thing is, the twist of twists is he portrays himself in his statues as having a woman's body. So there's a man's head and he's got breasts and he's got curvy hips. Because he's also portraying a political message. Hatshepsut's political message is, here I am, conqueror. And Aton's, he renames himself, Amenhotep IV, and renames himself Echnaton. And so Echnaton says, here I am, lover. His queen is none other than Nefertiti. And when he dies, there's this power struggle, this brief power struggle. We don't know exactly quite what happens to Nefertiti. I think it's fair to say she was probably offed in the power struggle. On the other end of the power struggle is Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun, Tutankhamun, you guys call King Tut, he was a boy pharaoh. He had married one of Echnaton's daughters. Echnaton only had daughters, so there was no option for a male pharaoh. So the generals in Egypt who were building an empire wanted a male pharaoh because they thought that they had more confidence in a male ruler in an imperialistic system. So they promote Tutankhamun to take over, and his real name was Tutankhaton. And so what they do is they talk him into changing his name from Aton to Tutankhamun so that they bring back the old gods. They abandon the new capital that Echnaton had built Tel Amarna, and they move back to Luxor, and they go back to Karnak, and they reset up, and they resurrect the old gods, and they go back to worshiping the old way. Tutankhamun dies. We now think he actually smashed his leg to pieces. He probably fell off a chariot, and that it was a fatal blow because he probably had a bunch of internal hemorrhaging, and it just slowly killed him from within. So I think that's the consensus now on how he dies. Because he was such a nobody, everybody forgot where he was buried. So one of the problems was every pharaoh wanted to be buried with gold, and because there was no coinage, gold effectively was the currency. So you couldn't really just bury pharaoh with gold. So what the priesthood would do is they would bury the pharaoh, and then the priesthood would break in and steal the gold and recycle it back into the economy. And because Tutankhamun was in such a disruptive period of time and such a nobody, he gets forgotten. And as a result, his tomb was essentially intact. And that's why we have so much from this guy. So it's unimaginable, having been in Thutmose III's tomb and comparing the size of his tomb to Tutankhamun's tomb, it's unimaginable to me what riches must have been in Thutmose III's tomb. Tutankhamun's tomb is, I don't know, it's probably like this big. It's tiny. Thutmose III's tomb feels like it never ends. You just keep going deeper and deeper into the ground. He gets replaced by a general named Ai, if I remember correctly, actually married. Oh, there was a Sneferuatu. I forgot her. We think that was actually Akhenaton's daughter. Don't name your daughter Sneferuatu. That is terrible. What were they thinking? First of all, that's too many syllables, but it's also not the prettiest thing ever. Of course, I'm part Scandinavian, and we have names like Brunhilde, so I guess whatever. She gets replaced by General Ai, and then he himself doesn't live very long. He ends up getting replaced by a general named Horemheb. Horemheb dies without any children, and the 18th dynasty ends. It gets taken over by a guy named Seti. Seti ends up with a son named Ramses. Ramses II is probably the guy you think of when you think of Egyptian pharaohs. Ramses II went on a massive building spree. It turns out a lot of what he built, he didn't build, somebody else did. He actually went and just chiseled, he didn't do it, he had somebody else do it. He chiseled off a person's name and then put his name on it and took credit for it. But he also did a massive building spree on top of that. And he built massive granite statue after massive granite statue in his honor and his glory. And he tried to reestablish the empire. He goes out on a conquering spree. He does conquer some of it. He doesn't quite pull off what was sort of the high water mark. Anyway, that's the 19th dynasty. And it's the dynasty of Seti and then Ramses II. That dynasty is quasi-successful. It's not the same kind of power and glory and innovation as the 18th dynasty, but it does mean a lot more monument building than the 18th dynasty. Just to give you some fun stats about Ramses II, he, in the Valley of the Kings, he doesn't just build a tomb for himself, he builds a massive tomb structure for his sons. And I believe he had one for his daughters in the Valley of the Queens. He ruled for 67 years. I have no idea how many wives he had. He had 92 sons and 106 daughters. He was a very busy man. And some of the monuments, like Abu Simbel, you look at it and like your soul melts. Ramses II had style. He was clearly a little bit of a sleaze, but the man knew how to build. Like Abu Simbel, if you want to see the monument of monuments, it's Abu Simbel. I think it's more important than the pyramids. Like the pyramids are huge, but they're just so mountainy. Abu Simbel has an artistic elegance to it that's hard to describe. The next dynasty is the 20th dynasty. its famous pharaoh is actually Ramses III. Ramses III apparently had a little bit of a cruelty streak. He deals with rebels, and he tells us about it in his palace. He's hacking off people's hands, cutting out their tongues. He has a pile of penises because he goes crazy and starts hacking off people's penises. He went ballistic, and the reason is because Egypt gets invaded. It gets invaded by a group of people that we don't have a name for. We call them the Sea People. The Sea People attack Egypt, Palestine, and what is today Turkey, and they conquer it. We think that the Sea People are the Philistines in the Old Testament, but we're not really that certain. And then the Hittites, of course, get smashed by these Sea People, and that's basically the end of the Hittite Empire. Egypt survives the conquest. It doesn't get conquered, but it's so bloodied and damaged afterwards that I think it broke Ramses III's brain, and he goes into this psychopath mode. The 20th dynasty, however, is never anywhere near the glory of the 19th or 18th dynasty. It eventually just crumbles and creates the third intermediate period, which goes 5 dynasties, and then that gets replaced by the late period. The late period is 6 dynasties long. In this period, the Nubians will conquer Egypt and begin a new round of pyramid building. They try to sort of restore Egypt's glory, and they do a fantastic job. They build, they do a whole new wave of artwork, a whole new wave of innovations and inventions. And then ultimately, though, that dynasty collapses. Egypt gets invaded by Assyria. Egypt will eventually be conquered by Persia. The Egyptians successfully lead a rebellion against the Persians and drive the Persians out and get their independence back. Persia will do multiple invasions trying to conquer Egypt, and they fail every time. And then, finally, Persia manages to pull it off. They manage, after a couple of centuries of fighting Egypt, trying to conquer it back, they manage to capture it. And I think they rule Egypt. This is the 31st dynasty. It's not really a dynasty. I think they ruled Egypt for 7 years before Alexander the Great comes and then destroys the Persian Empire. Alexander the Great conquers Egypt on his way to conquering Persia. He then creates his own empire, which is the 32nd empire, despite the fact that he's from Europe. You could stop now. The 32nd dynasty. This empire does ultimately collapse because when his son, Alexander IV, is poisoned, there's the power grab by the generals. And the general who ends up grabbing Egypt is a guy named Ptolemaeus, or Ptolemy. Ptolemy then creates the Ptolemaic dynasty, which is the Macedonian period. During this time period, Egypt is going to build the Great Library and the Great Lighthouse to add to its glory. So, right up until this point, we've got the Step Pyramid, the Great Pyramid, the Great Sphinx. Then we've got all the monuments built in the Luxor area like Karnak, and then Amenhotep III's massive temple, the Valley of the Kings, right, all of that stuff. And then, as if that's not enough, and by the way, I just talked about this much of it, as if that's not enough, then during the Ptolemaic period, we'll get the Great Library and the Great Lighthouse, which are, in and of themselves, each an incredible wonder. The Ptolemaic period ultimately is going to end with Marcus Antony and Cleopatra VII. Just for the record, she was the 7th Cleopatra. The Ptolemies, it's really cool. It's very easy to remember them. It goes Ptolemy the First, Ptolemy the Second, Ptolemy the Third, Ptolemy the Fourth, Ptolemy the Fifth, Ptolemy the Sixth. It goes all the way to Ptolemy the 14th, but I don't think Ptolemy the 14th ruled for very long. And I think they skipped a Ptolemy. I think they skipped like the 13th or something like that. It's a little confusing. For the record, Cleopatra was the product of inbreeding, like really bad inbreeding. I calculated this out at one point. I think she had, like if you go back, the number of ancestors in a generation grows geometrically, like it goes 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, 32 great-great-great-grandparents. She didn't have 32. I think she had 5. So that's not enough. That's not good. It's not good. Like at one point, one of her uncles or great uncles married his niece. Like it was bad. There was brother and sister at one point. And it's because the Macedonians misinterpreted an Egyptian rule. Whenever Pharaoh picked a bride and married her, his dynasty would adopt her. And then they would say, I married my sister for symbolic purposes. When the Macedonians had read that, they were like, oh, okay. And they began actually doing it as opposed to symbolically doing it. And so that was probably not the best of ideas. In any case, at the moment that Cleopatra and Marcus Antony are doing this, Egypt was on the verge of becoming the world's superpower again. Egypt had gone through this really rough period where it had fallen to decline. It's getting conquered by foreigners. It had recovered so much. The question was it going to be Rome or was it going to be Egypt? And the conflict between Augustus Caesar and Marcus Antony was really a question of whether it was going to be Rome or Egypt. And the Battle of Actium, where the Egyptian navy, which was bigger and better than the Roman navy, gets defeated because of the incompetence of Cleopatra and Marcus Antony's rule, made it so that Rome, basically by chance, is going to become the dominant power in the Mediterranean. And in 31 BC, Marcus Antony conquers Egypt. So that makes it so that Egypt is no longer has dynasties. From that point on, what you think of as pharaonic Egypt is done. It's finished. Shortly after Rome conquers Egypt, Christianity will come about, and Egypt becomes one of the first countries on earth to mass convert to Christianity. It depends on whom you talk to. If you talk to a Christian Egyptian, they will tell you they were first. If you talk to an Armenian, they will tell you they were first. It was one of the two or both. Maybe they did it at the same time. In any case, Egypt is one of the two first countries on earth to mass convert to Christianity. And it is one of the reasons why so much of the early church's work was done in Alexandria, Egypt. So like you think of the works that were done by Mark, right? And the liturgies, and then Athanasius, and then the whole Arian heresy, which was done by Arius. He was from Alexandria. Like all of that was actually originating from Alexandria in the early church. But it's all during the Roman period. The Romans really, 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 really hated how independent Egyptian women were. And so one of the things that they did was they made it illegal for women to sign contracts in Egypt. And so what Egyptian women did to get around that was they would actually go and buy a slave, a male slave, and then take the male slave to the contract signing, and then make the male slave do the contract signing. And then that way they could still be business owners and sort of do a workaround on Roman misogynistic rules. And then Rome itself eventually starts to come apart, and in the 7th century, Egypt gets conquered. I think 634 is the 642. I think 642 is the year Alexandria falls to the Arabs. And once that happens, right, the language of Egypt is going to change, and Egypt's going to go through another religious change where Christianity is slowly going to be outnumbered by Islam. By the way, all along the way, there was always a little bit of a Jewish population. In fact, at one point, Alexandria, Egypt was the largest Jewish city on earth. And it's why we have the Septuagint. The Pharaoh Ptolemy II had decided that it was inappropriate for so many Jews who no longer spoke Hebrew, they were speaking Greek. It was inappropriate for them to not be able to read their holy text. So he asked 70-something rabbis to get together and do a translation. Each of them do a separate translation, and he took the 70-something translations, and he had them compromise and merge into one. And that's the Old Testament you read today, is the translation, the English translation of the Septuagint. When we got a hold of the Dead Sea Scrolls, what was that, 1945? The Dead Sea Scrolls were about 300 years older than the Septuagint, but that's pretty close. And so we translated them, and the Septuagint was spot on. So there's no need for you to get a Dead Sea Scroll version of the Old Testament to get the more accurate version. The Septuagint nailed it. So there's good news. There's good news. We really are out of time, but I'll do a question or two. Yes.
So you mentioned that the pyramids were of great compasses. Like how exactly were they, and then how did they figure that out?
Okay, so the question is how exact was the pyramids in terms of being compass? So I forget, I knew at one point exactly how much of a degree it was off by. It's a really, really, really tiny fraction. Originally, we just thought that was their error, but one of the things that astronomy has gotten really good at is precisely, actually really even in Egypt during the period with the Great Library, the ancient, the people in the Great Library actually measured the parallax. So the Earth is on a couple of wobbles. There's actually, I think there's 2 separate wobbles that the Earth is on. But one of them makes it so that we're at a 23-degree tilt right now, but we actually sometimes are at 22 degrees and sometimes we're at 24 degrees. So the Earth is kind of like doing that little wobble. And if I remember correctly, that's a 40,000-year span of time. I think it's 20,000 years one way and then 20,000 years the other. They measured that at the Great Library. Like they knew that the Earth was doing this wobble. And they did it by looking at the stars. That's how precise the star measurements were. So one of the things that we can do is we can go back and look at that Earth's wobble because that changes exactly where the pole is relative to the pyramids. And it looks like when the pyramids were built, there was no error. So that the error now just simply confirms our math on the wobble and confirms Alexandria's math on the wobble. Which I think is like how? You can do a test at home, go into Google Maps, drop down on Giza Plateau, and then take the Great Pyramid and line it up with the screen, and it lines up. And it's not because Google Maps is lined up to the pyramid. It's just bizarre. Like, how did they nail that? But it also shows you how little we know. Like, for example, the ancient Egyptians had brain surgery. And we know the patients lived because we have their mummified remains. So we don't know what their condition of life was, but we know they lived. At the Great Library, they invented the steam engine. They invented a static steam rocket. They actually powered a mechanical play that used gears with steam power. Right? I mean, like there were these amazing innovations that were taking place. They made the world's first analog computer. The Antikythera device, which was basically an astrological computer. You put in the date that you wanted, and you could tell where the constellations would be because it would rotate these gears. Yeah, that's incredible stuff. Okay, one more, and then we have to go, or not. We can just skip the last one.
Who was the other person you mentioned competing with for the most battles?
Okay, so who is the other person? I didn't mention his name. So Thutmose III was undefeated. The other guy was Khalid ibn Walid. He was the Arab ruler. He was the Arab general who, under Abu Bakr, was sent to conquer Iraq. He was in 50 battles. He won 49 of them. And then the other one, he didn't win it, but he didn't lose it. He had 3,000 men, and he was fighting 200,000 Romans, and he extracted his men. I kind of feel like that's a win. I don't know how you do that. So yeah, he was essentially undefeated, because that wasn't a defeat. The fact that he got out of there is definitely not a defeat. I mean, those are better records than certainly Alexander the Great, although Alexander the Great would probably be in 3rd place. And you know, Robert E. Lee lost battles, Erwin Rommel lost battles. Like the people that we tend to look to in the contemporary period, they didn't have that kind of perfect track record. So it really is those three people who are, you know, even Julius Caesar had issues. So anyway, we good? All right, thanks for coming.